The necklace slipped from beneath the single father's faded shirt just as he bent down to gather the papers scattered across the marble lobby floor. For one breathless second, it swung in the bright morning light, revealing a small silver compass with a deep scratch across its center. Billionaire CEO Vivian Ashford stopped so suddenly that the executives walking behind her nearly collided with one another. The building, the meeting, the urgent calls waiting upstairs, all of it disappeared. She knew that necklace. She had fastened it around her husband's neck on the morning he left home for the final time. And yet, long after he had been declared dead, it was now resting against the chest of a stranger who looked terrified to be standing inside her company. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Echo Tales if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the unexpected ways one human heart can save another. The man holding the fallen papers was named Callum Reed. He was quietly spoken and dressed in a charcoal suit that had clearly been bought for a better version of his life. The sleeves were slightly short. One shoe had been carefully polished over a deep scrape, and his tie was held in place by a cheap metal clip. Beside him stood his young daughter, Maribel, clutching a yellow school backpack and watching the expensive lobby with the wary eyes of a child who had learned that beautiful places were often the least forgiving. Callum had not intended to bring her to the interview, but the neighbor who usually watched her had been taken to a clinic that morning, and the job at Ashford Global was too important to miss. A stack of unpaid rent notices sat in a kitchen drawer at home. His car had stopped running not long before. The private cleaning company where he had worked nights had cut half its staff, and every rejected application had pushed him closer to the edge of a future he could not bear to explain to his daughter. So he had taken 2 buses across the city, packed Maribel's sandwich, and prayed that someone would see his experience before they saw his desperation. Vivian stared at the necklace until the lobby noise seemed to retreat into a distant hum. Her late husband, Lucian Ashford, had worn that silver compass for many years. It had not been valuable by the standards of their wealth. It had cost less than one dinner in the restaurants their associates preferred. But she had given it to him when they were newly married and struggling to build their first company from a rented office above a bakery. Inside the back was an inscription only the 2 of them knew. Wherever you are, find your way home. Lucian had been wearing it when his small plane disappeared during a storm over the northern mountains. Wreckage had eventually been discovered, but no body had ever been recovered. Vivian had spent a long stretch of her life trapped between grief and uncertainty, unable to bury him fully because some small part of her still listened for his key in the front door. Now, in the clean white sunlight pouring through the lobby windows, the impossible object moved against Callum's shirt as though the past had walked into her building disguised as an exhausted father. She approached him without noticing the worried glances of her assistants. Callum straightened quickly, apologizing for the mess of papers and explaining that he had come for an interview in the building operations division. Vivian barely heard him. Her attention stayed fixed on the compass. When she asked where he had gotten it, Callum's expression changed. His hand rose protectively around the pendant, and Maribel stepped closer to his side. He said it had belonged to a man who saved his life. The answer was simple, but it struck Vivian harder than any explanation she had imagined. She ordered her morning schedule cleared and asked Callum to follow her upstairs. He hesitated, believing he was about to be accused of theft, but Maribel squeezed his fingers and whispered that they should tell the truth. Soon after, they were seated in Vivian's private office high above the city, surrounded by glass walls, expensive art, and the merciless daylight of questions neither of them was prepared to answer. Callum began slowly. Some years earlier, before Maribel had started school, he had been working as a mechanic in a remote logging town called Briar Ridge. His wife, Celine, had been ill with a heart condition, and he had taken every shift he could find to pay for her medication. One cold afternoon, while returning from a repair job on a mountain road, he saw smoke rising beyond the trees. He followed it and found the remains of a small aircraft scattered across a steep ravine. The emergency beacon had failed. The pilot was dead, but a second man was alive, badly injured and trapped beneath part of the cabin. Callum climbed down using a towing cable from his truck and spent hours freeing him before a landslide blocked the road. With no phone signal and the weather worsening, Callum carried the stranger to an abandoned forestry shelter several miles away. They waited there for rescue for some time. Vivian sat perfectly still as Callum described the injured man. Dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, a scar near his left wrist, a habit of tapping two fingers together when trying to think through a problem. Each detail pulled Lucian back into the room with such force that Vivian's chest tightened. Callum explained that the man had suffered a serious head injury. He knew his first name, but little else. He remembered a woman he loved and a company he had built, but he could not recall phone numbers or addresses. He drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking about a compass and repeating the word home as though it were the only part of his identity he could still hold. On what turned out to be their final morning together, the stranger pressed the necklace into Callum's hand. He said that if he did not survive, Callum must keep it as proof that one life had mattered to another. He also made Callum promise something strange. If Callum ever met a woman named Vivian, he was to tell her that he had tried to come home. Vivian rose from her chair and turned toward the city because she could no longer allow the stranger to see her face. For a long time, people had told her that Lucian's death was instant, that uncertainty should not become obsession, and that closure was a choice. Now she learned that he had survived the crash. He had spoken her name. He had waited in a mountain shelter, injured and confused, while she stood in front of television cameras thanking search crews who were looking in the wrong valley. The knowledge did not feel like hope. It felt like grief being torn open with a new blade. When she finally asked what happened next, Callum looked down at Maribel's backpack resting beside his chair. He said rescuers arrived eventually. Callum had collapsed from exhaustion and exposure. When he woke in a rural clinic, the injured man was gone, according to the staff. Another rescue vehicle had taken the survivor to a larger hospital across the border, but record-keeping after the storm was chaotic. Roads were destroyed, local systems failed, and several unnamed patients were transferred between emergency centers. Callum searched for a long time. He contacted hospitals, police departments, and aid organizations, but he had only a first name and a physical description. Then Celine's condition worsened. Medical bills consumed everything, and the search slowly became something he carried in silence. She eventually passed away, leaving Callum alone with Maribel and a promise he believed he had failed to keep. He had worn the necklace ever since, not as a possession, but as a reminder that someone had trusted him with the final piece of his life. Vivian's head of security, a stern woman named Odette Caro, entered the office after reviewing the preliminary information. She warned that Callum's story could be fabricated. The crash had been public knowledge, Lucian's appearance could be found online, and the necklace might have been stolen from recovered luggage. Callum did not defend himself angrily. He simply unclasped the compass and placed it on Vivian's desk. His hands shook as he told her to open the back. Vivian pressed the tiny release she had not touched in years. The metal cover lifted. Inside, beneath the inscription, was a dark brown stain and a narrow strip of folded paper hidden behind the hinge. Vivian had never known the compartment existed. The paper was fragile, its pencil marks faded but still readable. The message had been written in Lucian's handwriting. It said that Callum Reed had saved him when no one else knew where he was. It said Callum had a sick wife and a little girl who deserved a future. Then came the line that broke through the walls Vivian had built around herself. Vivian, I remember your face even when I cannot remember my own. Callum was telling the truth. He had not stolen Lucian's necklace. He had been entrusted with it. The discovery triggered a search unlike any Ashford Global had ever funded. Vivian used her company's legal teams, private investigators, medical contacts, and aviation experts to reconstruct the days following the crash. Hospital archives were examined. Paper records from rural clinics were scanned by hand. Former rescue workers were located across 3 states. Callum's interview was forgotten, replaced by something far larger. For a while, he and Maribel were given a room in a company-owned apartment while investigators followed every possible lead. Vivian remained guarded around him at first. Gratitude was mixed with pain, and pain often disguised itself as suspicion. Yet each day, she saw details no dishonest man would have bothered to invent. Callum packed half of every restaurant meal for later because waste frightened him. He repaired a loose cabinet hinge in the apartment without being asked. He checked Maribel's homework at the kitchen table each afternoon before reading the latest search reports. Most of all, he never asked Vivian for money. He asked only whether they were getting closer to finding the man from the mountain. As the search continued, Vivian began spending time with Maribel in the sunny company garden on a high floor of the building. The child did not treat her like a billionaire. She asked why Vivian never ate lunch, why her office had no family photographs, and why rich people built windows that did not open. Maribel explained that her father sometimes skipped meals and claimed he was not hungry. She spoke of Celine with the careful tenderness of someone afraid that memories could also disappear if left unattended. Vivian realized that Callum had been living through his own long grief while carrying hers around his neck. Two widowed parents from entirely different worlds had been moving through the same city, each pretending strength for a child or a company, each believing survival meant never admitting how tired they had become. The breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. A former nurse recognized Lucian's photograph. After being transferred from the rural clinic, he had arrived at a rehabilitation center under the temporary name Louis Arden because he could not provide identification. His injuries caused severe memory loss, speech difficulties, and periods of confusion. Later, he disappeared from the center during a fire evacuation. The records ended there. Vivian nearly collapsed when she heard it. Lucian had not died in the crash, but he had vanished a second time. The investigators then traced a handwritten note in the file mentioning a church-supported residence near Lake Corwin. Soon after, Vivian, Callum, Maribel, and Odette were in a car heading north through sunlit farmland, every mile tightening the silence between them. The residence stood beside a quiet lake, a pale brick building surrounded by maple trees and vegetable gardens. An elderly administrator led them through a wide corridor filled with afternoon light. She explained that a man matching Lucian's description had lived there for some time. He called himself Luke because it was the only name that felt familiar. He had regained some memories, but remained uncertain about which ones were real. He worked in the garden, repaired appliances, and sometimes spent hours drawing the same city skyline from memory. Vivian's legs weakened when she saw the drawings pinned along the hall. Every one of them showed the view from their first apartment. Lucian was sitting beneath a tree near the lake when they found him. He was thinner, his hair almost entirely gray, and a cane rested beside his chair. For several seconds, no one moved. Vivian had imagined this moment countless times in dreams, but in those dreams, he always recognized her instantly and ran into her arms. Reality was quieter. Lucian looked at her with gentle uncertainty. His eyes then shifted toward Callum, and something changed. He stood too quickly, nearly losing his balance. He remembered the towing cable, the mountain shelter, and the man who had carried him through the snow. Callum reached him first, steadying him exactly as he had done once before. Vivian approached slowly. She told him her name. Lucian repeated it as though testing a word buried deep inside him. Then he looked at the silver compass in her hand. His gaze filled with tears. He touched the deep scratch across its center and whispered that he had bought her sunflowers after their first argument because roses felt too formal. Vivian covered her mouth. No article, investigator, or stranger could have known that. Her husband was alive. Their reunion was not a perfect miracle. Lucian did not recover every memory at once, and some parts of the past never returned. He had to meet the life he once lived as though it belonged partly to someone else. He felt overwhelmed by the company, frightened by crowds, and ashamed of the years Vivian had spent grieving. Vivian, in turn, struggled with anger at the systems that had lost him, guilt for not finding him sooner, and confusion over how to love a man who was both her husband and a changed stranger. But they chose not to treat healing as a return to the past. They began again. They took walks by the lake. She brought him photographs without demanding recognition. He listened to stories about the man he had been while showing her the quieter man he had become. Callum expected to return to his small apartment and continue his job search once Lucian was safe. Instead, Lucian asked him to remain. He remembered little from the weeks after the crash, but he remembered Callum refusing to leave him alone. He remembered him speaking about Celine and baby Maribel while they waited for rescue. Lucian told Vivian that Callum had given him more than survival. He had given him courage during the worst hours of his life. Vivian offered Callum a senior role overseeing emergency preparedness and employee safety across Ashford Global, not as charity, but because his judgment, mechanical experience, and instinct to protect others were exactly what the company had been missing. Callum accepted only after confirming that he had earned the position. Later on, the silver compass was placed inside a glass case in the company's main lobby. Beneath it was a small plaque that did not mention wealth, titles, or tragedy. It read, "A life is never truly lost while someone is willing to keep searching." Ashford Global also created the Callum Reed Family Fund, providing emergency childcare and medical support for struggling employees. It was Callum's idea, funded jointly by Vivian and Lucian. Maribel helped design the fund's logo, drawing a yellow sun rising behind a compass. On a later visit, Vivian invited Callum and Maribel to the lake residence where Lucian had lived. They shared lunch beneath the maple tree in the clear afternoon light. Lucian wore no suit and carried no company phone. Callum looked healthier, though he still saved leftover bread without thinking. Maribel raced along the shoreline collecting smooth stones. Vivian watched the three of them and understood that the necklace had never simply been a clue leading her back to her husband. It had been a bridge between two families damaged by loss. Callum had carried Lucian's promise for years, and in doing so, he had carried Vivian toward the one truth grief had almost made her forget. Love did not always return in the form expected, but sometimes it returned through the hands of a stranger who refused to abandon someone in the dark. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who still believes in hope, and subscribe to Echo Tales. Your support helps more stories of kindness, healing, and second chances reach people who may need them. Special request: comment, keep searching below if you believe that no act of kindness is ever wasted. As the afternoon sun reflected across the lake, Lucian handed the compass back to Callum. Callum tried to refuse, saying it belonged with its rightful owner, but Lucian closed his fingers around it and explained that the compass had already done its job. It had found the way home, not only for him, but for all of them. Maribel ran back, carrying 4 stones, one for each person standing beneath the tree. Vivian held hers tightly as she looked at the husband she had mourned and the single father who had returned him to her. In that quiet moment, surrounded by light, she finally understood that the most shocking truth was not that Lucian had survived. It was that a struggling stranger had protected his memory for years without expecting anything in return. And because one ordinary man had kept an extraordinary promise, 2 broken families were no longer alone.